Hello, and welcome to the Hour of History podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman, and this week we're coming to you with a new episode talking about a new book out from Columbia University Press. It's called The Rise and Fall of the Religious Left, written by Dr. Benji Rolsky. He received his PhD in American Religious Studies from Drew University and is currently adjunct instructor at Monmouth University in History and Anthropology and part-time lecturer at Rutgers University, New Brunswick in Religion. As you can tell from what he does, he's a man of many talents. He brings an interdisciplinary approach to this book that looks at some television from the 1970s as a way of accessing this religious left. We talk not only about the new book, but we also talk about some of the struggles of the PhD and the adjuncting life, some of the successes about timing a book right, and some of the highs and lows of that chosen profession, the history career. We also talk about contemporary politics. So there's a whole lot in this episode. You're going to want to stick around to the end. As usual, you can see some highlights, some links to more work, and of course, suggestions at the Hour of History website, hourofhistory.com. Thank you so much for listening. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. Enjoy.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast, Our World.
Anytime, any place.
For show notes, the Hour of History blog, and more, head over to hourofhistory.com. For book recommendations about topics mentioned during the podcast, head over to hourofhistory.com/recs. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. Without further delay, the Hour of History starts right now.
So welcome to the Hour of History, Benji. Your new book, The Rise and Fall of the Religious Left, that is just 2 weeks old, is very exciting. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. Very much looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Yeah, now, me too. I full disclosure to everyone listening, I've always been interested in sort of American religious history. I've only had a couple of guests in the past, but on this specific topic, but it is really popular and really happening right now, and it seems like there's a lot of buzz around your book. Can you tell us a little bit of that before we get into the background and things like that?
Sure. Yeah. No. I mean, the timing has been wonderful. The topic itself, religious left, is obviously in any number of sort of headlines and journalistic accounts, newspapers, blogs. It seems to be everywhere. And then luckily for me, I also got into this bigger subject, the religious left, religious liberalism in general, and its history, through someone like Norman Lear, who is just as much in the media as the religious left is to a certain extent. To some, he's largely unknown. As I begin to talk about this, you have to sort of catch people up in a lot of ways, depending on how the makeup of the audience is, as far as generations and who's familiar, who's not familiar. So, I really couldn't be happier, and I was really, happy to write a little something on Mr. Rogers and his religious background as well. And I've seen any number of kind of overlaps between this Lear book or this religious left book and Mr. Rogers, and this kind of relevance moment that confronted America and its programming in the late 60s, early 70s, trying to make entertainment mean something to the day-to-day, at least from the perspective of Lear. So I've been really, really, really happy getting emails, very grateful people. Mr. Rogers is certainly in the air as well right now, and I was able to do a little TV work, talk about the article. And so, I really couldn't be happier with the reception. And I'm just coming back from the American Academy of Religions annual meeting in San Diego. And there was an equal amount of support and energy, and so I really couldn't be happier, and I'm just very thankful for the timing, and I've been able to sort of adapt the interests I've always had academically to discussions of sort of popular interest and public concern on an international level, national level. So I'm very much looking forward to getting into all of this. So I couldn't really be happier.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And you sort of start with that, and this can lead us to your background. You talk about watching 70s television as you were growing up, even though you weren't growing up in the 70s. Is this your background? What is your relation to religion?
So I for whatever reason, was raised on 70s kind of programming, and it's given me just this wonderful kind of window into contemporary programming, and it's created a little distance so that I think I can kind of view things in a contemporary scene in a way that helps me kind of get at it in a somewhat objective way. And so, yeah, for whatever reason, I was shaped by shows like All in the Family, Mary Tyler Moore, MASH, Taxi, shows that oftentimes had what could be called, for the lack of a better term, sort of a moral center at the sort of, I guess, center of a given friend group. So whether that's Mary or Hawkeye and MASH or something like that, there was always some sort of center figure. And I think what's so interesting about All in the Family is that I think the figure that center is certainly there, but it's in the figure of Archie Bunker. You know, it's in the figure of a bigot, of someone who's saying really kind of horrific things. So TV is challenging, or Norman or Mr. Lear is trying to challenge any number of conventions at the time that sort of have TV as this, as it was referred to in the 50s, I think, a wasteland. So he wanted to, yeah. So he has a very intentional vision with this kind of programming, and for me, I just happened to grow up on it, and so I tell this story. Not only did that shape me, but also sort of watching sporting events with my family, and at the end of these games, someone would make a miraculous play, and they would be interviewed, and the first thing he or she would say was, you know, I'd like to thank God or Jesus Christ or something like that. And my family really could never understand that. There was always a sense of, well, there's something inappropriate about this, the timeliness, the kind of out of placeness of these words and these sentiments. What are they doing here? So my own kind of background in shaping in popular culture, I guess, gave me, or has always given me, an interest in this type of material as a form of primary source material, you know, as an archive, as a digital archive. So for me, you know, whether it's a 1700 sermon of Jonathan Edwards or some sort of tract from the 19th century or some sort of television show from the 70s, to me, we're just talking different ways of defining the archive. And so I've been able to turn popular forms of culture into resources of historical and oftentimes sociological or critical kind of insight, because the book is as much a history as it is an analysis of religion, as it is sort of a social commentary on what's going on today. So a lot of that background autobiographical work, not unlike Lear, who put himself into his shows very often, very, very often, things like meathead, these sort of iconic phrases all come from his upbringing. And so I myself, my own background in shaping, informed this work very much as well.
So you've gone to this so-called wasteland, and you found the true, deep, rich content inside of it. But your training is in what field?
Well, technically, it would be American religious history. And so interestingly enough, all my degrees come from seminaries or sort of theological settings, but my undergraduate was in religion and history as a double major. But I've also been very intentional about being interdisciplinary. So my first two exams were pretty classic in the sense of, you know, up to 1865, colonial period, 1865, and then 1865 afterwards. But then the two other tests or exams I did, one in critical theory in the culture industry, the Frankfurt School, and then the fourth exam was in the sociological literatures having to do with culture wars and cultural warfare. So my technical training, you know, could go back to my master's at Yale in the Jonathan Edwards room, you know, classes on Jonathan Edwards, but then also classes with, you know, people like Catherine Lofton on religion and popular culture, and Oprah Winfrey. So a lot of my own writing was deeply sort of shaped by my experiences at Yale. Certainly with someone like Tisa Wenger, who I've worked with since an undergrad at Arizona State. My mentor, Gaston Espinosa, out in Claremont McKenna, who does Pentecostal work on Pentecostalism in North America and South America and Central America. So yeah, I've had a very rich kind of network of mentors and conversation partners. And then I've just been very intentional about being interdisciplinary and trying to model that for our work today.
Yeah, absolutely. And so someone who's been in these fields, their ears are, of course, perking up at these names and recognizing them and saying, wow, oh, wow, oh, wow. So you have all these connections that are wonderful.
Yeah.
But you talked about the timing in the beginning, and
Mhm.
I think a lot of people don't realize how impossible the sort of timing game is.
Yeah.
Where did this project start?
That's a wonderful question. So it's very just fortunate. This started, I would say, so my dad has a job working in TV. So at the moment he works on a show called Chicago PD in Chicago. And he's been a production manager. So it's always been about nuts and bolts. But I've always been fascinated by the storytelling, by the magic, by Hollywood, all that kind of stuff. So I've been surrounded by TV, but I didn't really know how to use it or how to make it applicable to fields of, I guess, history or studies of religion or cultural studies, media studies. Obviously, studies of TV have been ongoing in those fields for some time, but sort of bridging all those things together was a somewhat challenge. And I'd been interested in TV and sitcoms, and in particular, the use of satire in sitcoms to draw attention to something beyond just the plot line, given plot line of an episode. So I had known of Lear and all the family had grown up with that, but it was really finding out the origins of People for the American Way, his nonprofit organization that he founded in the early 80s. It was really finding out about that origin story that sort of provided the click, the sort of light bulb moment, which is to say, well, there was a People for the American Way, which was really formed in direct opposition to this thing called a moral majority. And in fact, we can look at these as an intertwined, imbricated kind of history. And so once that clicked, I kind of then said, okay, well, how can we understand his television? How can we understand his catalog, his cultural productions, perhaps as a form of argumentation, as a representation, illustration of what he thinks the public should be, how the public square should operate, how people should behave relative to one another, and how we should treat one another. So it was really finding out about the sort of interfaith background of that nonprofit, and then me being able to fill it out in other ways, being able to look at TV itself in the 70s as an emerging battleground in this thing called the culture wars. So as it got going, I had that model, and then having classes with someone like Catherine Lofton and having a sense of how someone could use a person and their wealth of stuff to make a bigger kind of argument about understanding religion in a given moment. So for Oprah, for Lofton, it was Oprah is indicative or representative or paradigmatic of what it means to talk about religion in this type of moment, in this given moment. And for me, there's so much work on the history of Christian right and American conservatism and all of that. Once I discovered that, it helped me put the argument together. And so that was 2011, maybe 2012. And I thought back, as far as, well, what I should have I've written on, perhaps I could have written on something a little bit more sort of in the bigger conversations of the field, maybe something on evangelicalism or something on the social gospel, as far as just about professionalization and just kind of survival and in precarious times of employment and all of that.
Yeah.
You just have to be strategic. And so I've thought about that a lot as far as, I'm very grateful for this timing and the fact that I started it 4 or 5 years ago in my program, because this book is really my dissertation. To be honest, it's hopefully an inspiring story to all those people out there who are doing something similar right now. Not unlike the Kristen Wiggs of the world. I went out and went to a bookstore and I bought, how to change your dissertation into a book, and just kind of put the work in and did the best I could. And I did have some conversation partners and mentors who I could refer to. So it really came together during my program, and this book is really a reflection of that dissertation, and then some of the more recent writings I've done that are kind of sort of show up in the end or show up in the conclusion. But I just I couldn't be more, I guess, thankful for the timeliness, and it's really just circumstance and just quite fortunate.
Yeah, and I think it is both inspiring to hear that you can actually turn a dissertation into something successful and well received, and also a heed of warning to people entering the profession. I mean, you're working on this thing for a decade, so you better be really interested in the topic.
That's true too.
And so maybe we can start getting into it. One of the things I noticed right away, just from the I think it's a well-designed cover, and the title's capturing and all this stuff. But you're already deep into sort of terminology. We have religious left, we have culture wars, the Christian right, moral majority. All of these things come at you really quickly. Could you define some of these for our listeners so we can have a sort of setting before we get into talking about like the American way and stuff like that?
Yeah, sure. Wonderful. So some of these things are organizations, some of these things are concepts, some of these things are terms. So I try, certainly be as distinct as I can. So I guess the title, I certainly had something different in mind. When I wrote it, less about a rise and fall, but I think because of the timeliness, the press thought it would be a good idea, to bring some attention to a narrative that is kind of populating in journalistic accounts and in newspapers and such. And so for me, the rise would be something like, from the 1960s onwards, we have civil rights, we have this wonderful kind of declaration of social concern and social justice. And how do we get from that moment to Jimmy Carter in 76 and talking about being born again and being evangelical? And we can get into that, if you'd certainly like. But really, how do we get from someone like Martin Luther King to Jerry Falwell? Being the kind of representation of religion in public life. And so for me, these terms, Christian right, Christian left, what I want to do is say that these are both terms, they're kind of artifacts of a given time, and then they're also shorthand for us to talk about certain subjects. So what I'm trying to suggest in this book and in this more theoretical work is that something like the religious left or religious right are terms not unlike religion. They're terms and categories that are meant to describe and capture something that is extremely complex, but it doesn't do a very good job of it. So in many ways, I think the works on the Christian right, the historical works, oftentimes I don't think have enough self-consciousness about the production and the manufacturing of something like the Christian right as an idea, meaning it's not just something in the world. It's not just something that's a given. It's something that has a history to it. And so for me, a term Christian right, religious left, Christian left, these are all sort of, I guess they're synonymous in the sense of Christian right, religious right. Those would be somewhat synonymous. They're terms meant to describe organizations and people, and typically someone like Jerry Falwell, who's a televangelist at the time, conservative Protestant, is oftentimes going to stand in for. So Falwell and the religious right or Christian right are oftentimes synonymous, meaning one is sort of standing in for the other. And so I think the contribution, I hope, of the book is that it brings attention to the less than take it for grantedness of these terms. Because my second book, what I hope to do is look at a lot more sort of conservative sources from the time period and really get into the hyperbolic nature of a lot of reporting at the time. So my argument would be that even the rise, or this idea of a rise of a Christian right, is largely something that's manufactured. It's largely something that gets created. It's not something that's just kind of given in the world. So what I'm interested in saying is these are terms, these are artifacts that come out of a particular time. So you can do a history of the term or the phrase Christian right, televangelist, televangelism, electronic church, and that's kind of what I try and do in the text. And so for me, Christian right is describing organizations, individuals, people who are broadly Christian in various sorts. So Mormon, Catholic, Protestant, any number of different sort of individuals. And I'm sure you have also you certainly have neoconservatism. You have Jewish individuals who are contributing to new right thought, to conservative thought. So that's, to me, what something like the Christian right would be. And I'm pushing for a different kind of understanding of it. Less from the bottom up, less from the grassroots, and more from the top down, kind of the strategists and architects who sort of put a lot of this together. And then so I try and do what people have done for the right, I do for the left. So religious left would be a term that comes out of a particular time, very recent time, that typically describes pastors, priests, rabbis. You think of William Barber, you think of Jim Wallace, you think of Elizabeth Warren, Mayor Pete, all these different people who are trying out progressive values or progressive language in the public square. So they're terms, but they also are related to something called American religious liberalism, which is a longer tradition of religious thought, of liberal thought in America that includes people like Walt Whitman and Henry David Thoreau and even Norman Lear. He purchased Robert Frost's estate and has been organizing a retreat for the last 30, 40 years with different close friends of his. So I would like to suggest is that these terms, religious right, religious left, there's much sort of givens in the world as they are products of scrutiny and historical study. And so then I also want to say that there's also this tradition, American religious liberalism, that Lear is fitting into. So if we want to use the hard and fast term religious left, we can. I'm also saying that there's a broader tradition that Lear is a part of, and that's what I'm trying to do justice to in the text.
Mm-hmm. And it's sort of fascinating to see or to hear now these roots of this deep study that goes back centuries coming out into the 1970s, because we're so limited in books. We only have so much space, and they kind of want you to get started in the 1970s. But you can see how these ties and these crisscrosses, nothing is so simple, which is fascinating. Now, so we get to Norman Lear, and biography's long been out of style in history, even though it still has its uses and it's still compelling, and often the best-selling popular press histories are biographies. You spin biography of Norman Lear and sort of a TV show biography, as well as an organizational biography, into this story. Can you sort of do that for people who might not know Norman Lear or some of his work?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so I thought about that as well. Biography, and I think in some ways this, to bring back again, I didn't think of a book like Oprah as a biography, but it kind of is. I mean, it's not necessarily interested in her sort of contextual, kind of intimate biography, although we learn a little bit about it. But what I tried to do was to sort of help people understand where he's coming from, his sort of historical context. And so just to explain a little bit, he grew up on the East Coast, in and around places like New Haven, and hearing about sort of the quotas from Yale and the sort of lack of Jewish representation, and also listening to his Crystal Radio, and listening to people like Father Charles Coughlin on the radio and FDR's Fireside Chats. So he's also surrounded by relatives who are writing very intentional letters to the president. He actually does this little routine where he says, he's talking about an uncle, I think, who addresses letters, "Dear Mr. President." So he's kind of brought up in this civically minded kind of engagement with state power, with federal power, this sort of give and take of being in conversation. And over time, he goes to college, but he wins an award based on his kind of rhetorical skills to even make college possible. So he's writing about freedom and freedom of expression as he's ascending in his education. But then he goes off to war. He flies bombing raids during World War II and comes back and tries to find work. At the same time, Lear is part of a moment where Protestants, Catholics, and Jews are thinking together about how to represent themselves relative to this kind of Nazi threat, this mid-century threat. And so Lear's coming also out of that period as well, where religion has a kind of civic value, what it can do for a larger kind of nation in helping interreligious communication and sort of dialogue in times of war. So he comes home and he works with different shows, including Martin and Lewis, and he starts to dabble in movies, and he's really mostly well known for his television programming of the 1970s, which included things like All in the Family, also Sanford and Son, also something like Maude, The Jeffersons, Good Times, Mary Hartman, which comes later in the decade and is more of a kind of satirical take on American culture and American public life and commercialism, and maybe perhaps a little bit ahead of his time. But for those who are fans of things like The Office of today, or any kind of British adaptation, Lear is largely responsible for getting that train started. All in the Family was a British adaptation in the same way that Sanford and Son was also a British adaptation, which is perhaps why his shows have so much to do with class, and why American TV in a lot of ways doesn't have much to do with class at all, say other than perhaps Roseanne or some sort of random show that comes out at some point. So Lear is partly responsible for bringing international kind of programming over to the US, and I think bringing some of the class interests with it, which is why we get this kind of white working class figure as the prominent sort of protagonist of the show. And so since then, Lear goes on to do a number of shows. He creates this nonprofit, People for the American Way, in the early 80s, to kind of rally the troops in an age of Reagan, or in this age of newly ascendant conservatism. And since then has been involved with People for the American Way, and just recently Netflix remade one of his shows, I think One Day at a Time. And then I think also ABC just put on an episode of All in the Family and the Jeffersons, I think, for a whole new generation of consumers. And I tried to write a little bit about that for a CNN opinion piece, and I titled it The Return of Archie Bunker. Because today, when you think of that image, you don't think of things that are necessarily, quote unquote, good or progressive. Even though when you ask Lear, he'll say the show is an illustration of the human condition and the sort of challenges of being human. So it's an ambivalent kind of complex legacy. So for those who may not be familiar, he did an episode of South Park where he lent his voice to Benjamin Franklin, I think, and it was this amazing episode of I'm a little bit country, I'm a little bit rock and roll, and it was this great satire of politics and just amazing. And he also became online an official in order to marry or serve as the officiate of one of the co-creators of South Park's wedding. So
what a life.
he has this wonderful lineage and kind of legacy that continues to live on. And even something like Family Guy, that's the most obvious, I guess, parallel. The opening number is basically the song sung by Edith and Archie at the piano. And Seth MacFarlane has been very supportive. I think he's either on the advisory board of People for the American Way, or they work together in some capacity. So, he's still very much, he's 97. He's still moving and grooving, as they say, and still very much in the public eye.
And so you had an opportunity that not a lot of historians get to actually talk with the subject of your book on a couple occasions. How did that change your work in any way or your perspective?
It did. It also sort of affirmed a number of things that I was thinking about at the time. As far as how could I interpret Lear as a subject of religion? How did he himself understand him as far as a Jewish individual, as a person of faith or lack thereof? So my questions to him were really about sort of help me understand how you think of yourself. And it just sort of happened. I was looking for adjunct work in my program, and thank goodness I included my dissertation topic in the emails that I sent out. So for those, in the world, definitely, if you're at that stage, include something like that, because you'll never know what'll happen. And so luckily, I included the title, Someone Knew of Someone Who Knew of Someone, and I got in touch. And luckily, I presented some work at UC Berkeley, People for the American Way, and got to go out there. And that's when I interviewed him, flew down to Southern California, and met him at his palace, and I got to talk to him. And some of the initial conversations were very much kind of like show and tell. He had forgotten about a lot of the things he'd written 30, 40 years ago. And one of the major things I use is something he wrote called Liberty and Its Responsibilities, which came out in some Columbia journalism book back in the early 80s. And it's kind of a distillation of his thought, kind of his philosophy. And so I was able to talk some of this through with him. Although I think if you were to suggest some of these ambivalent kind of complex legacies of the shows, I don't know if I think he'd be open to talking about it. I don't know if he would agree per se with really any of it, but I think he'd be open to it. And so I tried to use opportunities just to sort of take it in and show him some of the things that I was working with and catch him up to speed, and then ask him some more direct questions about, how do you understand yourself? How do you understand this programming? And so I was sort of eternally grateful for his time, and I was also, through him, put in touch with people at his center, and then people with some connections at People for the American Way itself, and so it was just he was very, very kind and generous with his time, and it was just a lovely. Like you're saying, like your subject becomes your sounding board, and vice versa, and you can push and prod, and it really gets to how do we use this kind of source material in our work, and does it have to adjudicate what we're saying, or vice versa? How do we deal with that? I tried to think through those questions the best I could, and it was really you bring up biography. He found out that I do a little religion and hip hop as far as sort of research and scholarly writing, and he gave me a hard time for not knowing about Hamilton. which came out at the time more or less, or was really taking off, or it was maybe the first couple months, and he gives me this hard time. And then a week or so later, he ends up buying me an orchestra ticket,
Oh,
and yeah, I get to go, and I get to watch it and take it in, and it was just kind of unbelievable. So
yeah.
yeah, you never know.
It really is a fascinating story, and kind of a story within a story there. And yeah, it's a neat thing to share. Now, one of the organizations you mentioned in that story was People for the American Way, and it's still ongoing organization. You talk about it a lot in the book. What is its role, sort of as a counter to this sort of moral majority?
Yeah, so excuse me, just on the surface, I think we can understand how it's couching itself as a product of its times. So that might be something superficial to say, but I think, titles, you have this kind of moral majority, and you have Norman Lear who comes along and basically organizes this group called People for the American Way. And to me, it's sort of an eye for an eye, tit for tat, which is what the sort of journalism at the time and reporting of the time picks up as well. So Falwell and Lear become kind of intertwined in stories about this emerging kind of culture war and television as this new battleground. So People becomes a sort of nonprofit response, or third sector, as sort of sociologists refer to as the third sector of sort of American public life. These nonprofits and think tanks are really taking off at this time. And it's really conservatives who are on the ball first when it comes to things like direct mail, nonprofits, think tanks, political action committees. The 70s really sees a restructuring, a kind of making of American political life according to these big kind of organizations. And so Moral Majority springs up, Christian Voice springs up. You have any number of advertising and marketing specialists and experts coming in and helping conservatives organize themselves. That's what I'm hoping to look into for the second book. And so you have any number, because they're trying to figure out how to get the message out to the biggest audience possible, the widest audience. And so messaging and direct mail become key components to conservative organizing and constituency making in a way that progressives and liberal individuals don't necessarily pick up on. Because something like direct mail is made available to people like McGovern and other sort of progressive candidates in the early 70s, but it's really the sort of conservative strategist who deploys it in a way as to really, as a source I have says, move the country, as opposed to raising funds for a given campaign, which is how sort of a progressive use was sort of used at the time. So People for the American Way becomes, because at first Lear didn't necessarily have that in mind. He was going to write a movie or a feature film to try and say something about the negative dimensions of televangelism, of sort of the Reagan presidency, of sort of American conservatism as it was understood at the time. And so he was working with people like Robin Williams and Richard Pryor to think about how to respond creatively. And eventually he kind of determined that it would take too long, and he has this kind of transformative moment where he sees, I think, Jimmy Swaggart or Pat Robertson give this speech, and it just kind of floors him, and he has this transformative moment and decides he has to get the message out quicker. And I really appreciate, his attention to messaging and to practical kind of logistical concerns, something that I think the religious left would do a bit more, or could do a little bit more to think about. And so Lear comes in a lot of ways gives progressive mainline people direction with something like People for the American Way. And so he begins to reach out to his progressive supporters, which include people like Bill Moyers, people like Marty, people like Theodore Hesburgh, from journalism, from the Protestant tradition, from the Catholic tradition. And so he begins to work with these people, and they say, well, you need the message a little bit shorter, quicker. And so he ends up creating these PSAs, basically saying, well, the America I know values things like freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of belief. And so he makes these kind of playful PSAs using individuals like Muhammad Ali, Goldie Hawn, celebrities to say, I like my eggs scrambled. Well, I like omelets. The freedom to disagree, that's the American way. And, another one, I like this music. I like that music. But the major one that got things going featured another white, working class, hard hat wearing individual driving a forklift. And the scene opens upon this person. He gets out of the forklift and he says, the preacher on TV, he's telling a lot of people today, what it means to be a good Christian. And politicians are telling us this too. And so he goes on to say, based on what the pastor says, my wife is 75% Christian and my son is 50%. And luckily for me, I'm 100% because I agree with everything he says. And so it becomes this thing, this message of, are you going to allow politicians to determine the nature of your Christianity in public life?
Hmm.
And Norman basically says, no, I'm not going to let that happen. And so I'm going to create this organization and through these PSAs. And then it eventually becomes, and through a lot of hard work and door to door and meetings and organizing, it becomes People for the American Way, which, if you want to understand the Christian right as interfaith, which I think it is, just to broaden it out and make it a little bit more complex, so is the religious left, and so is People for the American Way. So in many ways, it's the sort of interreligious response to something like the moral majority, which then you see in theatrical form in the last chapter of the book in I Love Liberty, which is a variety show that Lear writes himself with other people, which is also in direct response to the I Love America rallies that Jerry Falwell is holding in the previous decade. So in many ways, People is the attempt to culminate any number of organizing or instances of organizing, theorizing about how to respond to Reagan or how to respond to ascendant conservatism through the form of the nonprofit. And so that's how Norman's trying to organize the landscape, is through these organizations and television shows, and he's trying to do his best at the time.
And so these organizations and this interfaith activism, it's really huge stuff and really big, expansive business, led by people with a lot of money. Where are the people without a lot of money? Are they just the consumers of these sort of programs?
Yeah, the people without a lot of money. So meaning, so I guess people, it is pretty affluent. So Lear is a very, affluent individual, meaning like how would people without a lot of money like be involved, or how are they reached like through these different organizations?
Yeah, where are they in this story?
Yeah, well, in this book, they aren't really a whole lot of anywhere, I would say, just because I made it a point to, I guess, focus on a certain strata, on a certain kind of slice of liberal religious organizing and conservative organizing. So to me, historiographically, I think there's a overemphasis sometimes, or a romanticizing of the grassroots, of the sort of beleaguered, of the sort of bottom up, when in fact I think it's more helpful to understand conservatism and just how it operates more from the top down. So if anything, I'm dealing with kind of the strategists, the kind of theorists of a certain, say, of the sort of Christian right or new right for the next material. And then for Lear here, it's more, how does a certain very sort of affluent member of the Hollywood community understand liberalism and American liberalism, and then how religion is supposed to fit into that. So I think in some ways, like, you do have people on the ground who are working to make a lot of this possible, whether it's either today something like the Poor People's Campaign, or any number of grassroots movements trying to make possible what the religious left is after. That's kind of maybe speaking a little bit more to what you're maybe what you're asking, but in general, it's not going to include a lot of that, just because it's sort of focused on Lear and his career and what he's trying to do on a very, very kind of high, sort of affluent kind of level. But yeah, I mean, if that sort of speaks to the question at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I find it fascinating, especially too with some of my research and looking at the Quakers and the American Friends Service Committee, and there is a focus on the grassroots always, but you look at sort of, a lot of the Quakers get their start because they know a very famous Quaker president. And that's a good connection to have. So you can kind of see some of these connections are from very influential people. It's also very interesting that Lear specifically is tied into these pre-war sort of media. Like when we talk, if I ask my grandmother, what did you watch on TV when you were a child? She would laugh and say, well, we didn't have a TV. So it's very interesting to me, the 70s as a time period. These people are still connected to that world where TV I don't know, it's in touch with other forms of media perhaps better. Now you go towards the end, but you're not afraid to sort of take your argument and take your analysis into the modern time period a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit? You mentioned earlier in the conversation Elizabeth Warren and
Mm-hmm.
the election and how you're seeing some similarities.
Yeah, so I've been trying to apply or be a little bit more constructive, I guess, with my writing and my thinking when it comes to this kind of book. And because to me, I wanted it to be both historical and an analysis of religion and popular culture and of media. But then it's also, there's a little bit of a social kind of analysis in there too, or a little bit of a social commentary in that as well. And so I think, just the other day I was thinking, I wonder, all these pieces today about different presidential candidates and on the proverbial kind of left and what they're trying to do and how they're trying to voice themselves differently when it comes to religion and faith. I mean, I think this narrative of sort of progressive mishandling, progressive awkwardness, progressive difficulty when it comes to faith and just religion, quote unquote, talk or talk of religion is one that I think is deserved, but then I also think it's been manufactured in the sense of, I think that's a very smart conservative criticism of progressive individuals. And so what I'm very attuned to now is how things are represented in media, the optics of things, how things can be pitched. Because to me, I think a lot of progressive individuals think that they may have the best answer to a given problem, immigration, climate change, something like that. But I just wonder to what extent are those arguments persuasively defended? To me, they're oftentimes taken at face value. I think you take immigration, I don't think anyone would disagree with the idea that the biblical text speaks to the migrant, speaks to the immigrant, to the beleaguered, to the homeless, to the lost. But I think to assume that that's how everyone takes it in is somewhat naive. And so I think this rise is a belief in social justice, is a claiming to that tradition of social gospel, of using the gospel to speak to something social. I just don't know if the next step has oftentimes been carried out, especially in times that have been so defined by conservative talking points, to really say, you really have to be persuasive with this argument. You just can't rely on the moral gravity or the soapbox of your argument. You have to make it persuasive, and you have to make it persuasive to a very broad group of people. And so some sociologists write about how in this transition from kind of a class emphasis in the 60s to one of culture, progressive people lost the capacity to speak to working class people. And I think, thinking of Warren or Pete or someone like Clinton, just look at the level of affluence that we're talking about within progressive circles. I mean, it's almost not necessarily unprecedented, but I mean, what is the identity of the party when it comes to labor, when it comes to working class anything? I know my own wife and her dad, number of tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, a part of a number of unions, construction, and the level of disinterest when it came to when Hillary's representatives came around and handed out pamphlets, just the level of distaste or disinterest or lack of kind of genuine engagement was quite telling. So to me, you can make some fun of someone like Archie Bunker for a good decade, but you will at some point have to deal with him. You can't ignore him forever, which is arguably why he's kind of returned in a way that's very, very complex. So I'm willing. What I want to say is, this idea that religion has been quote unquote hijacked, this narrative that's really only been around since the, say, 60s or 70s, or maybe even sooner, that is a fundamental abdication of your accountability and responsibility for such hijacking. You need to begin as a group to begin to take a little bit of responsibility and accountability for one's own irrelevance or one's own ostracizing from the public square. There's this New York Times headline from a year or two ago: religious liberals have sat out of politics for the last 40 years, but now they want back in the game. And once I saw that, it just clicked. Oh my goodness, if we narrate the disappearance of fundamentalist post-Scopes, we have to narrate the disappearance of religious liberals from public life post Reagan. If this headline says anything at all, and it was eerie in the sense of how much it was, how weirdly it went together. Obviously, it's steamrolling complexity and historical context
Right.
and all these other things, but at the same time, I just want to say, that narrative gives the other side all the power in the world and really abdicates any kind of agency you have in creating something of an alternative.
Interesting.
So, yeah, anyway.
Yeah, it is kind of it's them, not us.
Uh-huh.
But
Uh-huh.
we don't have a sort of TV set in the center of our household where everyone will tune in and watch the same show anymore. Now we have Netflix that,
Mm-hmm.
you can watch whatever political tinge you like. Does that
Mm-hmm.
change the conversation at all?
I think it does. Yeah, I mean, at the time there are 3, 4 networks. Hundreds of millions of people are watching a show at one time. There's just not that level of influence anymore,
Hmm.
which is why I think something like social media and its usage is so tempting, but so terrifying and so frustrating.
Hmm.
I think civil rights or just social justice took off when it did because TV was showing things that no one had really seen on TV. I just wonder, marches and organizing and attempts to kind of create awareness and expression. What is that? What's the value of that or the significance or purpose in an age of constant content and
Huh.
constant exposure to things all of the time? So, I love hashtags as much as this next person to a certain extent, but, be careful when it comes to becoming identified with the party of the squad. I know it makes for
Mm.
a good Twitter thing, but if President Trump knows how to do anything, and if conservative people know how to do anything, it's to use that against progressives.
Yep.
And I'm not saying you have to necessarily completely change what you're doing, but at the same time, just kind of realize the vulnerability or the kind of arena that you enter into when it comes to this world of Twitter as the new governing to the people, governing to the masses. This is the one weak link in democracy that people have been concerned about for some time, whether it's FDR's fireside chats or whether it's Donald Trump through the Twitter handle.
Hmm.
There's always been this ambivalence about mass rule, through mass democracy. So we're kind of in that moment of a fractured media landscape, like you're saying. Um, doesn't make a lot of common experiences available to people other than maybe going on your phone and buying something off of Amazon. So, I mean, yeah, that's why people are writing about consumer culture and consumption as being one of the few things that really brings us together as a people and
Hmm.
where all that's going. That's what, Captain
Yeah.
Lofton suggests in Consuming Religion. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that's what I would say to that.
Yeah, it's really fascinating stuff, and that is one of the neat things about your interdisciplinary approach. I
Mm.
talk to a lot of historians, and a lot of historians they just won't engage with me in the present tense because
Oh, wow.
because they like to stick in the past, but I think we can use those, and but you have the tools. You've studied sociology, you have this sort of like interdisciplinary approach that works. I think it's fascinating stuff. Now, there was one more thing I wanted to talk about. You mentioned
Mm-hmm.
it a couple times in our conversation about getting the adjunct gig and
Mm.
adjuncting. I think a lot of people are interested in this. I've seen your book atop lists of the top books by contingent
Mm-hmm.
workers, and
Mm-hmm.
um, it's something I've done. I've adjuncted, and maybe you
Mm-hmm.
could just talk a little bit about your path through the PhD. You've earned your PhD. You've been published by a university press. I mean, you're
Mm-hmm.
blurbed by Kevin Cruz for
Mm-hmm.
for heaven's sake. So you're
Well,
doing
thanks.
things right. What are some of the challenges of this life? What are you looking to accomplish going forward, so on?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So I'll speak quite honestly about all of this. Yeah, so I did not adjunct in my program. I probably should have. I got the email. I sent the emails out, but I instead got in touch with Norman Lear, and the rest is kind of history. I probably should have. It really kind of depends on what you're after. To before I get too deeply into anything, just in the sense of it is very good, I think, to be interdisciplinary. Like you're saying, the intellectual merit and value of it is very good. I don't know professionally how employable it is. So we have to start talking about, because I know the conversations that you're talking about, and I know those same conversations would expect someone like myself to be able to adjudicate between what's been suggested to me, the fluff and the stuff, meaning the more public work and the more kind of quote unquote intellectual work. I think the academy, both in the history department or American studies or religion, is at a bit of a crossroads. I think history is trying to become more quote unquote relevant. I mean, just look at the Washington Post and the Made by History column. I don't think everyone should be writing op-eds. I think op-eds are an incredibly powerful source of influence that should be handled with the responsibility that it deserves. I think op-eds can be abused, and I think they can be abusive when it comes to, like, I wrote something on Kanye West for CNN, and I think a lot of the op-eds that were writing on him were borderline irresponsible. I think there's a form of intellectual malpractice that happens sometimes when axes are grinded rather than research conducted when it comes to this type of work. So this is a long way of saying adjuncting is the way to get a job. Adjuncting, teaching, to me, is a way to get work. If you want to do all of this and go to graduate school, but also, keep in mind, historians, I think, are capable of doing so many different things than just going into the academy. The contingent, people at the contingent have been very good about pointing that out. So I think scholars of religion, scholars of media, historians, scholars of history are all talented individuals and can do many things that are both inclusive of the academy and outside of it. So it's really a matter of what is your vocation and what is your commitment? Because to me, as you've pointed out, you're right. I do have that kind of blurb. I am still contingent. I am still an adjunct. I think in some ways that disjuncture between the adjunct and the Cruz blurb is felt throughout the profession. And to some extent, people don't really know what to do with it. So all that is to say is, I think you can ascend within academic circles through the adjuncting, through the work, the incessant worrying. I mean, just be ready for the stress and all these other things. I think you can ascend through the classroom and through the world. But I also think that you can ascend, or you can achieve certain things through the purely kind of intellectual, which is what I've tried to do. I think my work also tends to be a little bit prophetic at times, or it tries to, or at least it tries to call out things that I think are deserving or perhaps need to. I don't know to what extent that has added to any kind of reception. We'll kind of see how that goes. But as far as the life, it's a difficult and kind of challenging one. It's one that isn't necessarily exaggerated at all when you see the different stories. So I'm kind of a case study, I suppose, in many ways of like a living one of, having this type of contingent work, but then being maybe graced or lucky enough or fortunate enough to be extemporaneous, to be able to sit down and maybe write an 800 word piece, 1,000-word piece on something. I've had to learn how to do that, but maybe I'm a quick study. So just, it's just been kind of how I've seen myself formed, I guess, in the academy. Not going to an Ivy League, PhD program, not being tapped into the kind of networks that sort of force the academy to be bent in certain directions. That is just sort of the way it is to a certain extent. So all this is to say that, I think you obviously support yourself through the classroom. That's how you network. That's how you make connections. I would also say that route does not necessarily go hand in hand with having a university pressed book and having the Cruz blurb. Because I think, just to be completely and utterly honest, brilliance, not to say anything about anything, has a cost. And I'm not saying that to toot a horn. I'm not saying that for any reason. I'm just saying that at times can be something to consider. as you begin to think about strategizing, as you begin to think about professionalization, as you begin to think about how you fit into a given department. It's just something to think about. And I don't know when, to write about it or how to think about it anymore. But I would say that the academy is in a strange kind of place, and I think it's looking to make changes. I think it's looking to adapt. I think it's looking to look to the future. I just don't know if it knows how. And I think contingent people then become the people responsible for explaining to everyone else how that transition is supposed to happen.
Yeah.
So I think, social media is oftentimes seen as a detriment. It's seen as a form of self-promotion, but what's not understood is that the conditions of one's survival are crumbling. And how else do you make yourself known than through these channels?
Yeah.
So there's a lot, to unpack. It's a valuable question. It's also one that we could talk about, even more for a while. But, that's just been my experience, is that, I really appreciate the support and the senses of, success and all these different things, but then also knowing that it's semester to semester still. And, how do you reconcile that? So, I don't have an answer. I wish I kind of did, but at the same time, you just continue to, hopefully you're passionate about the work and you continue to do it. And some of this Rogers stuff as of late has made me feel like I've, started to make a little bit of a difference, or feel like I, reaching, bigger audiences and people who are receptive and interested. So there's lots to be said.
We didn't really get to talk about the Rogers stuff. We don't have much time, but if you wanted to give us a minute or two about Rogers and reaching people and where you are right now.
Yeah, so thanks. I mean, I wrote something. I was grateful enough to get a piece with The Conversation. It's a beautiful website that brings together journalistic editors and academic authors and writes 800 to 1,000 word pieces on any number of topics of the day. And so luckily they have a relationship with the AP, and luckily PBS picked it up, and it's really become viral and was able to go on TV and really talk about what he meant to the world and what he meant to America and what he meant to his audiences. And he's very much, living out what he was about, which is listening to people from where they're coming from. And in many ways, that's kind of what this book is trying to do. I know that people are yelling at each other today at a volume that's almost unprecedented in languages and idioms and terms and pictures that are horrific and offensive. But one thing I've learned is, Rogers helped us listen to the smallest of voices, and I think he could also help us listen to the loudest of voices as well. And that's what I try and embody in my own work. It's why I think we should engage conservative sources, conservative argumentation, conservative mobilization, conservative everything more seriously and more intentionally, and I think that's happening. Books are coming around. There's one with Oxford that just came out on conservative news cultures, a book on Fox populism that's also really, really good, from Cambridge. Really, really good. So to me, the work has been a blessing. I've been doing any number of radio spots, and to be honest, the radio stations reaching out to me have been conservative Christian radio stations. That is where the work is. Rogers as a bridge to help people understand each other from across the chasm that separates us today, politically, religiously, culturally. So, I couldn't be happier and more thankful.
That's great. And of course, at hourofhistory.com, we're going to link to your new book, and we're going to link to these pieces that you've done. But aside from your work, which we most certainly suggest today that everyone goes and checks out, what sort of suggestion do you have for the Hour of History audience?
Yeah, I would say check out, I had some great idea, but now I've sort of lost it. Check out some of this work on conservative stuff, on taking something like Fox seriously, taking something like conservatism sort of seriously, instead of thinking that it's some sort of outmoded idea or something like it's all can be understood through someone like Donald Trump. I think there's some really interesting work coming out, and I think we might be a little bit of a forefront of maybe a whole kind of emerging conversation that I've already sort of jumped into with some of this. How do we talk about sort of conservatism as working class and vice versa, and the branding of that. So jump in if and when time allows. And then also maybe watch a little bit more TV here and there. Take a break. All this academic stuff is really great, but God forbid, watch some cable television. Watch something that people are seeing on a daily basis, and who knows what you'll find.
Yeah, I think that's great. Great suggestion. And I think, everyone could take just a minute to chill and turn on the TV. And we're not saying it needs to become your life, but
yeah,
that's always fun. It could become your life, as we've seen. It can be successfully a field of research. My suggestion is one of a friend who is also he's at Temple University working on his PhD, and he's created his own podcast. It's different than mine. It's not an interview, but a more narrative podcast. It's called A Very Broad History of Werewolves and Other Things, in which Travis Roy sort of talks about popular culture and things like werewolves. And he was not originally someone studying popular culture, but in kind of the reverse way at Temple, we have to teach classes right from the get-go. And he was assigned a popular culture class, and he's just taken it and done extraordinary things with it. And so there's about 15 episodes out now where he'll do a short talk for 15-30 minutes about something like werewolves or vampires. And I think these are the kind of things and these expressions that a lot of time contingent faculty create that are just extraordinary. The amount of creative energy that comes from people who are working all the time and not being paid to be creative outside is just extraordinary. And so we appreciate your work, Benji. I hope everyone checks out The Rise and Fall of the Religious Left. Is there anything else you want to add before we sign off here?
No, thank you very much. And if all things work out, I should be giving a talk at Temple in the spring.
Yes.
Yeah, I know Laura Levitt very well. She and I go back kind of years and years, and I think we've been talking about it. She and I caught up a little bit recently. So I mean, if anything, everything goes according to plan, it'd be great to see you and meet you and continue all of this further.
That's great. And thank you so much for joining us on Hour of History. It's our world, anytime, any place. So long.
Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out our recommendations page at hourofhistory.com/recs. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. There you'll find links to the books mentioned during the podcast, and if you choose to purchase one, you'll be supporting the podcast in the process. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, make sure you head over to the Hour of History blog, found at hourofhistory.com/blog, with articles being released fairly often on topics relating to those covered in the podcast as well as others. With that, we conclude this episode and hope to have you back for the next one. Take care, and again, thanks for listening to the Hour of History podcast.